Kia ora tātou. Ko Māori te waka, ko te rarawa te iwi, ko te uriwa hina te hapu, ko te uriwa hina te marae. Ko te mea tatahi e mihana ki tōku tupuna te ripi, nānei i hainatia te tiriti. Ki tōku whai a hoki, ko hingai te tau nei, e tako tō mai ana rā kei Pukepoto. Nō reira e pihopa rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Te Tiriti, as we've heard, was presented here in 1840 in the language of biblical covenant. And I think just in the last few days, Shane Jones has suggested that that's a nonsensical interpretation. And I think he's foreshadowing some of the debates that might be about to come. I've just read in the newspaper this morning that speculation that it's treaty policy now that's holding up the government negotiations. And it's going to give us a lot to think about in what at times I think will be quite a nasty, vitriolic, racist context. And I'm hoping that what I want to say today may help us to think about how we might respond to that and how we might interpret the language that David Seymour is proposing in his referendum, because I think even if he doesn't get the referendum that he wants, the arguments that are implicit in it will no doubt influence discourse in the next little while. And the role of the church and of Christian people is an important one and a potentially influential one, but only potentially, because I think it has to be handled very carefully and sensitively. There's nothing the secular world hates more than a bishop trying to be a politician. But that doesn't mean there's not a distinctive voice that can't be presented. So what is that voice, and so on? And I think, in response to Shane suggesting that the covenantal interpretation is without foundation, we only need to look to Henry Williams, who said here in 1840 that the covenantal interpretation for him meant there could be no trickery or disingenuity on the British part. It was a solemn and enduring commitment. Te Tiriti would, as a matter of course, be honoured. Covenants emphasise the relational rather than the contractual. Te Tiriti is not then a rule book. Its focus and meaning is broader and more significant. No matter how seriously and consistently it is breached, or how satisfactorily it is honoured, one cannot say that its influence is incapable of restoration, or that, on the other hand, it has been implemented and of no further concern. MacLean argues that biblical covenants reveal a God of steadfast love, holiness, righteousness, commitment, justice, and mercy. These principles give the language of religious metaphor something different and perhaps more to say about human relationships than the secular principles of the treaty. Because these secular principles are drawn from legal and political interpretations to manage tensions between the English and Māori texts. Their tendency is therefore to diminish the substantive effect of the articles and, in religious terms, the human dignity that they protect. The partnership principle, with its positioning of the Crown as senior and Māori as junior partner in a them and us binary, especially weakens Te Tiriti. The treaty principles are generally interpreted to favour the English text, its cession of Māori sovereignty to the British Crown contrasts with the Māori text and the conditional rights of government that it conferred. The Māori text is clear. The British Crown would have no power to intrude on Māori authority over their own affairs, and Māori would participate in the new government with equality of tikanga. Initially, according to the contemporary political status of subjecthood, this was a limited participation. However, as New Zealand's citizenship replaces subjecthood and continues to evolve, ideally to develop the rights, obligations and capacities that come from holding a share in the authority of the state, citizenship becomes a status through which equality is claimed and expressed. Human equality's scriptural foundations predate its secular development. Scriptural authority for the idea that racism, which is often what inspires treaty breaches and compromises the inherent human condition, is well established. Its opposite is a fundamental equality that John the 23rd argued must be claimed by each person as marks of their dignity. Creation in the image and likeness of God means that personhood is distinguished by an essential dignity that belongs equally to all and not just some people. Equality is not differentiated according to one's place in a racially determined scale of human worth, nor is it determined by one's place as senior or junior partner in a secular project, or can it exist outside culture. Covenant also explains Te Tiriti's prominence in the Church's public memory. Memory brings the Church into contemporary public policy. Firstly, its memory of silence, just occasionally interrupted from the 19th through to the mid-20th centuries, when Te Tiriti's breaches, land alienation, disruption of language and cultural and economic deprivation, for example, so obviously affronted human dignity. Its memory of a rigid distinction between the religious and the secular, which meant that although Bishop Pompallier, for example, and as we've heard, apparently harboured reservations about Te Tiriti's wisdom, once it was signed, he did not intervene when his fears about the British intention proved well-founded. Pompallier did not speak on the covenantal presentation at Waitangi, which was indeed the styling of the Anglican missionaries. But by 1863, his exhortations to submit to colonial power during the Waikato War reflected an obvious political alignment with government aspirations. As he said, "Leave the rudder of the natural life to the Queen in London and to her governor at Auckland, as you have left the rudder of your souls to the Pope at Rome and your Bishop at Auckland." Certainly, speaking out against Tiriti breaches grounded in racism in the 19th and early 20th centuries would have placed the Church on the social fringe. However, such positioning occurs by secular and not religious values, and should not matter to an institution seeing itself as in but not of this world. Instead, as Leo XIII explained in 1890, from God has the duty been assigned to the Church not only to interpose resistance if at any time the state rule should run counter to religion, but further to make a strong endeavour that the power of the gospel may pervade the law and institutions of the nations. Later, in the mid-20th century, the Second Vatican Council emphasised the Church in the world, the public implications of religious mission. By 1971, the Australian Catholic bishops teaching that racism is foreign to the mind of Christ was not an idea from the political fringe. In 1998, the Synod of Bishops for Oceania remarked that the Spirit is moving the Church to discover new ways of telling the truth of Jesus Christ in a secular society. The treaty provides one of the secular contexts where that truth is explored. These political and religious developments mean that, as a second illustration of memory's influence, the Church is more inclined to recall its own resistance when it proclaims constant and universal truths about the inviolable dignity that belongs to all and not just some people. A dignity that would preclude Te Tiriti's breaches. In Australia, Stockton summarised the Catholic Church's response to colonial violence as general apathy with intermittent stirrings of a troubled conscience. The same summary applies to New Zealand, where recent interventions show that the Church's conscience is indeed troubled, and that this influences its contemporary outlook. As the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference explained in 1995, the Church was present in 1840 and is still present in 1995. Through its social teaching, the Church seeks to ensure that the dignity of persons and the common good of all are reflected within the economic, social, and political structures of society. Where there exist situations of conflict, the Church seeks that social and economic life be directed toward just and peaceful solutions. Claiming one's dignity as a religious obligation requires political agency. When it is expressed through rangatiratanga, agency demands the political space to do justice to oneself. The idea that God is especially the God of the poor and oppressed does not presume that poverty and oppression are permanent states. Liberation from these is a requirement of human flourishing as the purpose of politics and as the fullness of human potential in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, dignity's opposite is simply the inability to live a fully human life, which is the ultimate deprivation arising from land alienation, for example. In this context, one might consider Archbishop Desmond Tutu's observation that biblical truth could never be an opiate to the people, for it spoke of a God who was notoriously biased in favour of the poor, of the despised, of the weak, who rejected as abomination a religion, no matter how elaborate and meticulous its ritual and worship, if it did not issue in a concern for those who turned out to be God's favourites, the orphan, the widow, and the alien. Again, the religious concern is for the extension of the fullness of humanity to all and not just some people. It is logically impossible to prescribe what that means for other people in practical political terms. Therefore, the assimilationist presumption that people should not look for the fullness of humanity within their own cultures is a denial of human equality. Te Tiriti in its breaches, as much as in its honouring, provides a context for thinking about relationships between religious precepts and secular means. De Torre's explanation of that relationship is especially instructive. If God is the transcendent, beyond it, common good of society, the immanent, within it, common good of society, must therefore be a social order which empowers or facilitates every individual in it to attain his or her own perfection. In other words, what is material, purely earthly, must be for the sake of what is spiritual, transcending the material universe, not for its own sake. Te Tiriti demonstrates a profoundly religious language for thinking about Te Tiriti as a statement of who belongs to the society it foreshadowed and how. It is therefore an instrument of opportunity for Christian reflection, prophecy and advocacy, consistent with Koopman's 5 modes of prophecy, developed to support the democratic hopes of post-apartheid South Africa. These are prophetic envisioning, prophetic criticism, prophetic storytelling, prophetic analysis, and prophetic policymaking. These modes of prophecy may be interpreted through the discourse of reconciliation, which theologically corrects a fractured relationship between God and penitent. However, when social and structural sin is recalled and contested, reconciliation develops a collective and public dimension, drawing together the Christological and the anthropological by locating Christ at the centre of proper human relationships. Prophecy is ongoing because justice is not always identifiable and definable with absolute certainty. One cannot say justice has been achieved and we are all free to do something else. But human dignity provides principles for ongoing relationships. And when these principles are not evident in treaty policy, one finds what Broughton and Prentice call justice postponed. As they explain, the politics of postponement is to set aside reconciliation, whereas justice, they say, is to name injustice properly. Naming injustice properly is to accept honest accounts of human failing, including policy decisions that use race to place people in different positions on a scale of human worth. It is to see Christ in the people of our daily encounters. Seeing Christ in this way means that racism is not simply a matter of political or ethical question, but also a matter of Christology. It is, as Garrett argues, a question of how we understand the incarnate God, because God in Christ is present in suffering people. And as Jesus remarked, inasmuch as you did it unto one of these, the least of thy brethren, you did it unto me. These are religious truths that for the Church will generally transcend secular concerns and fashions. Yet from the 1980s, the New Zealand Church's enthusiastic acceptance of biculturalism, as though it was an unproblematic and singular path to justice, provides a case study in secular fashion leading Christian expression. The possibilities for deeper theological consideration of Te Tiriti's character and the hope that its contemporary policy interpretations might hold are thus overshadowed. Arbuckle's argument that biculturalism is a demand of justice is in fact one of many possible outcomes of theological reflection on Te Tiriti. A reasonable alternative interpretation is that biculturalism overshadows self-determination, thus diminishing people's capacity to work out independently what it means to claim agency as a mark of dignity. The construction of Māori and Pākehā as internally homogenous and always easily identifiable and distinguishable populations is not necessarily an accurate reading of cultural context or political possibility. Biculturalism's positioning of Māori outside the Crown, as though the state does not belong to them, as it belongs to anybody else, further diminishes political possibility. Its associated treaty partnership principle is a weaker political authority than the participation that comes from holding the same share as anybody else in the authority of the state. As Justice Williams put it, and when I told him I frequently use this quote, he wondered what some Australian academic would possibly find of interest in a New Zealand Supreme Court judge. And also, one doesn't ordinarily and not always properly turn to the judiciary for political insight or guidance, but I think this remark which he made as chair of the Waitangi Tribunal is especially instructive and useful to frame our thinking both theologically and politically. Fundamentally, he says, there is a need for a mindset shift away from the pervasive assumption that the Crown is Pākehā, English-speaking and distinct from Māori, rather than representative of them. Increasingly in the 21st century, the Crown is also Māori. If the nation is to move forward, this reality must be grasped. Te Tiriti especially, as its promise of British subjecthood evolves into the more politically substantive New Zealand citizenship, and ideally reflecting equal tikanga, may instead be interpreted as an instrument of human solidarity. John Paul II said that solidarity requires people to see one another as equal participants in the banquet of life. The banquet of life parallels political arguments for interpreting Te Tiriti as an instrument that requires equal and distinctive Māori participation in kawanatanga. Participation as a complement, not an alternative to rangatiratanga. Participation as shareholders in the political authority of the state, not its junior partner. Anne Salmond argues that the binary distinction between Pākehā and Māori, along with its linked counterparts, civilised versus savage, science versus superstition, Kiwi versus Iwi, lies at the heart of race-based thinking in Aotearoa, New Zealand. However, as she also explains, race is a colonial construct. It is not the same as whakapapa, grounded in genealogical relationships and also in relationships with the personified physical environment. Whakapapa, not race, provides the person with identity, belonging and connectedness with other people and the environment. It is the place where one finds dignity and indeed humanity. Whakapapa is not used in the style of race to create hierarchies of human worth. Instead, it establishes iwi and hapu as both cultural and political communities, whose relationships with one another and the Crown hold possibilities for human equality that are not so easily taken for granted by a politics of race. Salmond asks whether relational thinking and institutions, including tikanga and marae, might not offer more promising ways of understanding and honouring Te Tiriti or Waitangi. Race is not a foundation for political authority. It provides context for discrimination or for the lesser political standing that colonialism requires. But race is not the basis for political equality. Humanity itself provides that basis, because it is by virtue of humanity that one exists in the image and likeness of God, which in turn provides the ultimate rationale for the Church's interest in what it calls the earthly city. Human relationships with one another and with God are theology's principal concern. Salmond uses the hui as a secular metaphor one may also use to describe religious solidarity. She says that in the rhythms of the hui, ancestors and descendants, hosts and visitors, men and women, orators and singers, join in ceremonial exchanges. The kawa alternately sets them apart and brings them together, forging new relationships and renewing old ones in reciprocal exchanges. This is also a metaphor for political relationships as ongoing. Just as religious truth is revealed over time and context, political relationships change with developments in human knowledge, values, and expectations. Human relationships and their political form are not static. They occur in context, including the context of equality of Māori and English tikanga, which means that contemporary citizenship cannot require culturally homogenous expression. As the rangatira Te Kemara said, and as we've heard this morning, and it's noteworthy that he was initially opposed to the agreement, saying that Pompallier had told him that if they signed, they would become slaves. But anyway, he ultimately put it at Waitangi, let us all be equal, let us all be like, then remain. But the governor up, Te Kemara down, no, no, no. Theology has much to say about the nature of citizenship as the conceptual framework that describes who belongs and who does not. Its concern is for a deeper belonging than the political alone is equipped to consider. Faith and reason mean that politics is never confined to which side has the numbers to prevail in today's political contest. Instead, they contribute to politics as a contest of ideas, motivated by a deeper good than whatever might satisfy today's self-interest. Te Tiriti is concerned with belonging to political communities and their powers and responsibilities. It also speaks in general terms about human relationships and thus the nature of humanity itself. Theological reflection on these truths may contribute to the formation of political ideas about what makes human relationships just. Benedict XVI wrote that the pursuit of justice must be a fundamental norm of the state, and that the aim of a just social order is to guarantee to each person, according to the principles of subsidiarity, his share of the community's goods. Decision-making authority and power is then a good that all, and not just some people, are entitled to share. In 2023, debates about Te Tiriti's place in public life occur with respect to Māori language, co-governance, the Māori Health Authority, Māori seats on local authorities, and the ACT Party's proposed referendum, apparently to diminish the meaning of the treaty. Its proposal to affirm the treaty as an instrument requiring that all citizens of New Zealand have the same political rights and duties is an argument that in the party's further discourse privileges equality as sameness, to discount the argument that equality may exist only through culture. These are ultimately debates about the legitimacy of cultural expression as much as they are debates about political authority. While biculturalism does presume a Māori place in public life, it is culture per se, not the political model that is chosen for its expression, that matters most. Self-determination is realised and expressed through culture. Culture matters to public policy because it is the frame through which people interpret the world and make sense of their relationships with God, other people, and the natural environment. It influences how people learn and interpret political experiences and set aspirations that have personal meaning. It is through culture that justice is conceptualised and that people develop personal understanding of what it means for Jesus to say that I have come in order that you might have life, life and all its fullness. An idea that draws connections among faith, indigeneity and human rights. Equal tikanga places culture at public administration's centre. Culture also appears in the commitment to protect wairuatanga, which Hobson gave here in 1840. Equality of tikanga presumes that solidarity should influence state policy making. However, tino rangatiratanga presumes that the state's function is not to make policy over and above the authority that belongs to hapu as political communities, and which predate the agreement. Hapu are political communities formed through spiritual relationships with the natural environment, which means that the cultural context of land rights, for example, may also be a matter of the religious freedom that Hobson promised. Culture means that policy making is not a technical and objectively neutral task. As a mark of human dignity, culture means that questions about how policy is made, why and by whom and for whom are measures of just social, economic and political institutions. People inevitably view the state through culture. They fairly contribute to public life only when they may think and express themselves in ways that make cultural sense. Conversely, cultural exclusion from the public life of the state, coupled with the misrecognition of rangatiratanga, means that some people are less well placed to influence the paths that their lives will follow. Exclusion is solidarity's opposite and dismisses the Māori right to live, think and participate in public decision making as Māori. However, Te Tiriti's conceptual foundation is in humanity itself. Senior and junior partnership is not then a political framework conducive to supporting each person to participate and share in the state's authority with the expectation that their voice has the same opportunity for influence as anybody else's. The state cannot belong equally to everybody if some people are its junior partners, not its equal shareholders. It cannot then uphold each person's culturally formed and experienced dignity. Human equality in the image and likeness of God can only be given secular expression through substantive political equality as the person made in that image. Te Tiriti's truth is thus bigger than any one political philosophy. Drawing this out in the political realm requires careful attention to context, but also for the church, the leading, not the following, of secular thought. Truth is drawn out through the public memory of the church's presence at Waitangi, its solidarity with the argument that Te Tiriti be honoured as a covenantal agreement, and also the memory of the church not always raising its voice against transgressions of justice. Its public memory supports the church's response through reconciliation and as part of its prophetic mission in favour of human dignity and equality. To these ends, in 1990, on the sesquicentennial of Te Tiriti's signing, the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference proposed celebrating the occasion in the spirit of Jubilee, and in particular to undertake the twin tasks of renewal and reconciliation. Later, The Australian Catholic bishops argued that the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Christ could not be marked with any authenticity if we are not reconciled with one another. These are among the deeper theological truths that the Church requires to make its unique contribution to what the covenantal Te Tiriti means now and beyond. Kia ora tātou katoa.